Yes, guys, right, we are currently at Great Barr Hall. Do you want to have a look underneath Great Barr Hall? If you do, sit down, shut your mouth, and then listen up.
Great Barr Hall's one of those places where the ruin almost tricks you. Because when you see what's left today, it'd be easy to think the story is only about a wealthy old mansion that was abandoned, damaged, and slowly left to fall apart. But the more you look into Great Barr Hall, the more you realise that the ruin's only the final chapter. Because this place had already lived several different lives before it ever reached the state people see today. Long before the broken windows, the fires and the missing roof. Even the arguments over restoration, this was an old family estate known as Never Else. And that name takes the story right back to the Scott family. By the 17th century, there was already a house here of some size. And one of the clearest records comes from 1666, when Richard Scott was recorded at Never House with 5 hearths. Now that might not sound like much on its own, but in that period, hearths were taxed and recorded. So the number of hearths in a house gives us a rough idea of the size and status of the property. A house with 5 hearths was not a little cottage tucked away in a field, it meant several heated rooms. A family with a certain standing and a household large enough to show up properly in the records. So when we talk about Great Barr Hall, we're not starting with a sudden grand mansion that appeared out of nowhere in the 18th century, because the roots of the place are much deeper than the basement that it stands on. By 1760, the house was being described as a handsome and commodious dwelling house with stables and a coach house. It also had a walled garden amongst its many other gardens, which tells us that even before the famous strawberry Gothic version of the hall, this was already a comfortable and respectable country residence. The big change came later when Joseph Scott came to live here in the late 1770s and begun turning the older Never House into something much more ambitious. In that period, wealthy landowners were not just improving houses because they needed another bedroom or a better kitchen. They were using architecture and landscape to show confidence, money and social position. A country house was a home, but it was also a message. Joseph Scott remodelled the older house into a Gothic-style mansion, giving it the kind of look that made the place feel older, grander and more romantic than a plain house would have done. The pointed arches and the towers, and even the way the buildings sat within the estate were all part of that effect, because the house was being dressed in a style that suggested age and family history. But ambition on that scale could be dangerous if the money started running out. And historic accounts say that Joseph Scott spent most of his fortune rebuilding the house and improving the grounds. By the mid-1780s, the Scott family were in a serious financial trouble, and that financial pressure pushed them away from the hall, opening the door to the next major chapter. The house was leased out, and the man who came in was Samuel Galton Jr. Now, Galton was a Birmingham Quaker, a banker and a gun manufacturer, which makes him a complicated figure straight away, because he belonged to a religious tradition associated with peace while also making money from firearms. Through Galton, Great Barr Hall became connected to the infamous Lunar Society, and this is probably the most famous chapter in the house's history. For anyone that don't know, the Lunar Society was not a club in the modern sense. It didn't have a fixed headquarters or a membership list. It was more of a circle of inventors, including doctors and scientists, even manufacturers and engineers who met in each other's houses to discuss the subjects that were changing the age they lived in. They talked about steam power, chemistry and electricity, amongst other things such as trade, religion and business, all of which was beginning to shape the future across Birmingham and the Black Country. The names connected with that circle were not small names. We had people like Matthew Bolton, James Watt and Erasmus Darwin that were all linked to it. For a period in the late 18th century, Great Barr Hall was one of those places where these conversations happened. And that gives the building a completely different feeling when you imagine it properly. The hall wouldn't have been silent, empty, and it wouldn't have had a great big hole in the roof like it does today. There would have been horses arriving outside, servants moving through the rooms, fires crackling away and food being prepared for some of the sharpest minds in the Midlands. The Lunar Society got its name because meetings were often arranged around the full moon, when the extra moonlight made travelling home along dark roads easier. Now that's an image worth holding on to because it places Great Barr Hall right between the two worlds. Inside the house, men were talking about inventions to make the future easier. Yet outside the house, they were still leaving by moonlight through a countryside of lanes and fields. The estate around the hall also kept changing, and the landscape was never just a background scenery. The grounds were shaped and improved over time, with important names associated with the site, including Humphrey Repton, John Nash, George Gilbert Scott, and possibly even William Shenstone. The big pool was formed in the 18th century and became one of the strongest features of the estate, giving the house a dramatic setting across the water. And later, the upper lake added more scale to the grounds, and together those stretches of water helped make the place feel less like a house in a field and more like a country estate. There was once a boathouse too, built in the 19th century to a design connected with George Gilbert Scott, and although that feature's now gone, it helps you paint a picture of how the estate once looked. So just remember, we have the hall, the lakes and the trees, the paths and the driveways, all designed to create a picture that looks like a full country estate, which is difficult now because modern photographs tend to show the ruin on its own. But Great Barr Hall was never meant to be understood as just a building. The setting was part of the story. In the 19th century, the hall gained another unusual feature when a small chapel was built near the house, probably to a design by George Gilbert Scott around the 1850s. And the strange thing is that apparently the chapel was never consecrated. So although it had the look and purpose of a religious building, it never fully became a chapel in the official church sense. Later it was used as a billiard room, which is one of those details that tells you a lot about country house life. Because a space could be built with serious religious character and then later become a room for leisure games or even socialising. Beyond the grander side of the estate, there was also a working will that's much easier to forget. A place like Great Barr Hall could not run on architecture alone. It needed stables and carriage houses, along with coal stores, service yards, gardeners, cleaners and cooks. The main rooms might have carried the family name, but the daily life of the house depended on the people whose names are much harder to find. By the early 20th century, the old country house world was coming to an end. After Lady Bateman Scott died in 1909, the estate moved into a completely different life when it was brought by West Bromwich Poor Law Guardians. At first, the site was intended for orphan children from the workhouse, but from 1918 it became part of a hospital for people with learning difficulties. The wording used in official records from that period can be harsh and uncomfortable today. I'm pretty sure I'd even get cancelled for using some of them. But it's important to know that the people who lived there were real people. They weren't just names in a hospital file. And every single one of them had a life before they arrived here. Some had families who worried about them, and some had relatives who visited when they could. Some of them would have even had fears or needs that were being interpreted by doctors and systems much bigger than themselves. That's the part of the hospital story that matters, because the building didn't simply change use on paper. The whole landscape changed meaning. The same estate that had once been shaped for family status, leisure and polite arrival became a place of wards, medical routines and long-term residence that would have affected the daily lives of the people inside. By the 1930s, more hospital buildings had been added across the grounds, including separate accommodation for female and male patients, and the site became known as St Margaret's Hospital. For much of the 20th century, this was not an abandoned place at all. It was completely staffed and full of daily movement. Families came to visit and staff came in for shifts, and patients lived within the estate while the old country house setting became part of a much larger institutional world. Some people may have found care, stability and routine there, while others may have experienced restriction, loneliness, or a life shaped by decisions they had very little control over. And that's why I won't turn this chapter into just another abandoned lunatic asylum. It had a real history and real people that lived there. And one of the clearest examples comes from March 1955, when the local papers reported the case of Kathleen Bradley, a 40-year-old woman from Walsall who had already spent around 20 years connected to St Margaret's. According to the report from the 16th of March 1955, Kathleen had first been sent to Great Barr when she was just 19 years old, and the article says it was originally understood to be for just 12 months. She was only around 3 miles from her home in the centre of Walsall, but according to her relatives, 20 years passed before she left that institution again. 20 years, mate. That's part of the story that makes you stop, because this was not someone sent hundreds of miles away to a place nobody knew. Kathleen was still close to home, and the family were close enough to know where she was. Close enough to care and close enough to keep fighting for her, but the system around her appears to have been strong enough to keep her there for 2 decades. The newspaper report does say that during those years she was sometimes allowed to work outside the hospital on licence. It names Bloxwich, Erditon and a hospital in West Brom. So Kathleen was not hidden away in one room for 20 years in a way that people might imagine from a horror story. The reality seems to be a lot more complicated than that. She could be trusted enough to work outside, but not free enough to simply leave and return to ordinary life. She was a top prefect student 3 years before she eventually wound up at Great Barr Hall. However, it took 20 years for her sister to arrange for Kathleen to be examined by an independent mental specialist, and according to the article, his view was blunt. He reportedly told Kathleen that she should never have been detained in the first place. Now, that don't in its own prove every detail of the case because it's been reported through the newspaper, but it does show exactly what her family were arguing at the time. That Kathleen had lost years of her life inside an institution when she may never have needed to be there at all. A fortnight before the article was published, Kathleen had been taken away from Heathlands Hospital in West Brom, where she'd been working and returned to Great Barr. Once she was back there, she was examined by visiting magistrates who recommended that the order keeping her detained should be confirmed. But even that was not the final decision, because the last word rested with the Board of Control in London. 4 days later, on the 20th of March 1955, the story had already become bigger than just Kathleen Bradley. The newspaper reported that Councillor Mrs. Minnie Evarts, a former member of the management committee at St Margaret's Hospital, was putting together a scheme to change the law covering people that was then described as mental defectives. That was the official language of the period, and it's harsh to modern ears. But it matters because that was the language used by the system that controlled people's lives. Mrs. Evarts wanted all cases to be reviewed every 12 months by an independent panel of doctors. She said she weren't criticising everyone in the mental health service, but she believed mistakes had been made, and that when they were made, there was a reluctance to admit them. In the context of Kathleen Bradley's case, that line's important because it suggests that people were not only worried about one woman, but about whether the system itself had a built-in problem. The same article printed letters from readers, and those letters showed just how divided and emotional the public reaction was. There was one mother from Spark Hill who wrote about her 18-year-old daughter, and at this point she'd been in St Margaret's for 3 years. According to that mother, her daughter had run away, and as a punishment had been locked in for 6 months. She said that her daughter was well enough to help with the babies, but not sane enough to be allowed home. And she asked a question that cut straight through all the official language. Why not give enough help for the child to come home? There was also a very different view from a nurse in Birmingham who said that she'd worked at St Margaret's for 7 years, and that she didn't recognise the picture being painted. She said that Kathleen enjoyed herself dancing with other patients. And that matters because if this story is going to be told fairly, it cannot pretend every single person saw the hospital in the same way, which is the same with St George's in Stafford and St Matthew's in Burntwood. But then another former patient wrote in saying that the people inside were at the mercy of ideas about what made a normal person. That's one of the most powerful points in the whole story, because it gets to the real fear behind these institutions. Once someone had the power to define you as abnormal or weak-minded, how easy was it to challenge that label? I found another article that mentions the case of Gerald Privet. He was aged 33 and had reportedly been detained in mental institutions for 17 years. A man from Northfield wrote that there was nothing mentally wrong with him, and said that Gerard had been moved from Coleshill Hall to a place in Liverpool where he was working as a tinsmith. And again, that does not prove every claim made in the letter, but it does show that Kathleen's case was not being seen in isolation. Readers were connecting it to a wider pattern, and by the following year, the same wider question had reached a national level. In the 1950s, the issue of wrongful detention in mental hospitals was becoming a public concern, and one of the strangest cases connected to that debate was the story of Dr. Donald Johnson, a medical practitioner, also a barrister and later a Member of Parliament. According to a newspaper report from the 22nd of October 1956, Johnson had become known as a champion for people who claimed they'd been wrongly detained, or wrongly certified as mentally ill. But the reason he'd taken up that cause was not simply professional interest, because Johnson said that he'd been through the system himself. The article says that in 1950, while he owned a hotel in Woodstock near Oxford, Johnson was given a drink of sherry which he believed had been laced with Indian hemp. Now, after chucking people into asylums for taking hemp, then I'm pretty sure they'd never let me out. Anyway, after that, he was taken away, certified and shut inside Warnford Hospital. After around 6 weeks, the effects of the drug wore off and Johnson was released. But getting out of hospital was not the same as clearing his name. For the next 5 years, he'd fought to prove that he'd not actually been insane and that he'd been wrongly certified. That's probably the most unsettling part of his story. Donald Johnson was not a poor man with no connections, and he wasn't someone without education or status. He was a doctor, a barrister and eventually an MP, and even described the process of clearing his name as a 5-year fight. In 1955, Johnson became an MP, and once he was inside the House of Commons, he repeatedly raised questions about the proportion of involuntary, certified patients who were being admitted straight into mental hospitals, and how many were being admitted after an observation period in a general hospital. His campaign helped put pressure on the government, and the article says that Winston Churchill, who was Prime Minister at the time, when he announced the setting up of a royal commission to look at the laws around certification, detention, discharge and supervision of people who were said to be suffering from mental illness or even mental defect. That's where Johnson's story matters to Great Barr Hall. Not because his case happened at St Margaret's, because it didn't, but because it shows the national world that St Margaret's belonged to. These institutions didn't exist in isolation. They were part of a national system, and by the mid-1950s people were beginning to ask whether the system had always protected vulnerable people, or whether in some cases it trapped them. And that brings us back to Kathleen Bradley. In March 1955, the case had forced people locally to ask whether a woman from Walsall had been wrongly kept inside the asylum. By October 1956, Dr. Donald Johnson's campaign showed that the same fear was being raised nationally. So when we talk about St Margaret's Hospital, we have to be careful not to flatten it with one simple story. It wasn't just a haunted asylum, and it wasn't just a place of care. It was an institution shaped by the beliefs of its time. And those beliefs gave enormous power to officials, doctors and visiting magistrates. By the middle of the 20th century, the old hall was still standing, but the estate around it had changed dramatically. Hospital buildings had spread across the former parkland, and in 1955 parts of the historic service area were demolished. Parts that included the clock tower, stables and parts of the east wing, all done to make way for more hospital facilities. That was one of the moments when the old estate layout was cut back to suit the needs of the institution. It was not a single dramatic destruction of the whole hall, but it was part of a slower process where the house and grounds were being adapted for a very different purpose. The most damaging chapter began when the hall stopped being used as a hospital building in 1978. That's when a building like this becomes vulnerable, because while it's being used every day, people notice problems before they become disasters. Someone might spot a damp patch forming on a ceiling, or a slipped tile after heavy rain. Whatever the damage is, it can demand attention before it turns into something worse. But once a building's empty, those warnings can sit there for months or even years. Rain gets into the roof and timber starts to rot. Plaster, well, it just begins to fall. Plaster, well, it just begins to fail, and broken windows let in weather and birds. Overnight, all the metals just vanish, no doubt ending up in the tack yard as vandals make their way inside. And every year that passes makes the building harder and more expensive to save. That's where the modern story of Great Barr Hall becomes frustrating, because people know the building mattered. In 1986 it was reassessed as a Grade 2 star, which recognised the hall as more than just an ordinary old building. But unfortunately recognition doesn't keep water out, and a listing doesn't repair a roof or secure a window. It certainly don't solve the question of who's going to pay for the work. In 1988 the site was sold by the Regional Health Authority, and after that, the future of the hall became tied up in private ownership. Arguments erupted about cost and security, and how difficult it was going to be to bring such a damaged building back into proper use. In 1989, plasterwork and woodwork was stripped out as part of work connected to dry rot, and that's a painful detail because interiors were not just decoration. They were part of the evidence of the house and they show how rooms were arranged, how people moved through the building. Once those details are gone, the building loses part of its memory, even if the outside walls remain standing. What makes the decline even harder to understand is that demolition had already been seriously discussed. In a House of Commons debate in 1995, it was stated that Birmingham's Regional Health Authority had applied to demolish the hall in 1974, and that in 1976, Walsall Planning Committee had approved an application to demolish both the hall and the chapel. So Great Barr Hall avoided one kind of ending, but it never truly escaped danger. It was not knocked down in one moment, but it spent the following decades being damaged by weather, vandalism and fire. Great Barr Hall didn't fall apart because no one knew it was there. People knew about the old Scott family house, and they also knew about the Lunar Society. They knew that the building had enough importance to be protected. The problem was knowing that a place matters and actually saving it are two completely different things. By the time you reach the ruin today, you're not just looking at the remains of a mansion. You're looking at the places it's been pulled through several versions of Midlands history. The old rural estate's still there in the story of Never House and the Scott family. a Georgian obsession with image and improvements there with Joseph Scott's Gothic rebuild. We got the industrial alignment with Samuel Gordon and the Lunar Society, and the design landscapes still there in the pools, drives and surviving shape of the grounds. We've also got the hospital story of St Margaret's, where the estate became part of a completely different world of patients, staff and families. The wrongful detention debates there too, in Kathleen Bradley's case and Dr Donald Johnson's campaign, where people began asking whether the system has always protected vulnerable people, or whether in some cases it just simply trapped them. And the modern heritage problems there with the ruin itself. Plans that were never enough to stop the building from falling into the state people see now. That's why Great Barr Hall matters. Not because it was simply grand, and not because famous people once visited, and not because it became abandoned later on. It matters because the same place managed to hold the story of family status. A building can be lost quickly if someone tears it down, but Great Barr Hall shows that a building can also disappear slowly while everyone's still talking about saving it. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable part of the whole story, because a house with this much history, this many connections, and this much public attention could still be allowed to reach this point. It makes you wonder how many other places are quietly losing the stories before most people even realise what was there in the first place.